Story 1. I've had Tourette syndrome since I was 10. The first time I blurted out a random word in the middle of class, everyone laughed. I didn't know why, until I realized it wasn't me laughing along. By then, it was too late. My classmates branded me the weird kid. Over time, my motor and vocal tics became background noise to everyone else. But for me, they were constant interruptions, a cruel dance of involuntary movements and sounds. Barking up the wrong tree, that was my newest vocal tic. It came out loud, sudden, and clear. A strange one, sure, but they always were. People who knew me shrugged it off. People who didn't either smiled awkwardly or turned away. Life went on, but about 3 months ago, things started to change. My tics were always nonsensical, a jumble of meaningless words and sounds. Now, though, they were purposeful. It started small. One day, I walked past a couple arguing on the sidewalk. My tic blurted, "Don't trust him." I froze, embarrassed, but the man just shot me an irritated look. The woman? She paled, as if I'd just confirmed something she already knew. I tried to explain, but she waved me off and walked away briskly. The man followed her, cursing under his breath. I chalked it up to coincidence. Until it happened again. I was in line at the grocery store, standing behind a man buying an armful of expensive-looking steaks. My tic shouted, "Check his pockets." He stiffened, and his eyes darted to the cashier. She looked suspicious, and so did I, but before anyone could say a word, he bolted. Security caught him near the exit. Turns out he'd been shoplifting other items hidden in his jacket. I told myself it was a fluke, a strange, bizarre fluke, but the incidents kept piling up. My tic started predicting things I had no way of knowing. A neighbor's house catching fire hours after my tic whispered, "Careful with the stove." A stranger slipping and breaking his wrist moments after my tic muttered, "Watch your step." Every time it happened, the coincidence felt less like chance and more like something else. Then came the night it saved my life. I was walking home from work late, the streets eerily quiet. My earbuds were in, but I wasn't listening to anything, just trying to drown out the silence. I turned onto a dimly lit side street when my tic screamed, "Run now." I froze mid-step, heart hammering. There was no one around. No sound except the faint hum of distant traffic. My feet refused to move until my tic shouted it again, louder, more frantic. "Run now." I didn't question it. I bolted. As I rounded the corner, I glanced back. A shadowy figure stepped out from the alley I just passed. Tall, broad-shouldered, with something glinting in their hand. A knife? I didn't stick around to find out. By the time I reached the main road, the figure was gone. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying the moment over and over. My tic had warned me. It had known. After that, I stopped doubting. If my tic said something, I listened. They were rarely wrong, but the warnings came at a cost. At first, they only guided me away from danger, but soon they started leading me toward it. I was crossing a park one evening when my tic whispered, "Bench. Look under the bench." I hesitated, but something, curiosity, compulsion, pushed me forward. Underneath the bench was a wallet, stuffed with cash and IDs. The owner was nowhere in sight. Another time, my tic said, "Follow him," as I passed a man walking quickly down the street. Against my better judgment, I did. He led me to a parked car, where he handed off a suspicious-looking package to someone in the driver's seat. A drug deal? Maybe? I didn't stick around long enough to find out. Each encounter left me more uneasy. My tics were no longer random outbursts or even helpful warnings. They were leading me into situations I wanted no part of. Then came the night that changed everything. I was at home, trying to relax, when my tic whispered, "It's your turn." "What?" I muttered, confused, but it kept repeating, "It's your turn. It's your turn. It's your turn." The words drilled into my head, relentless. My body felt heavy, my movements sluggish, like I was fighting against an unseen current. The next thing I remember is waking up in a dimly lit room. My hands were sticky, my clothes soaked in something warm and metallic smelling. Blood. I sat up, heart racing. On the floor beside me was a knife. My hands trembled as I picked it up. Flashes of memory came rushing back. a figure struggling against me, a muffled scream, the blade slicing through flesh. I staggered to my feet, staring at the lifeless body crumpled in the corner. "Oh, iwi sparat. No, no, no." My tick spoke again, calm and steady. "It's your turn." I turned toward the mirror on the wall. My reflection grinned back at me, a wide, unnatural smile that didn't match the terror on my face. It wasn't my reflection. It was something else, and it was still whispering. Story 2. I've lived with Tourette syndrome since I was 12. Most of the time, I barely notice my tics anymore. They're like breathing, constant, involuntary, and just part of who I am. But the blinking has always been the worst. It's not just a twitch. Sometimes I'll blink so hard and so often that my eyes water and my vision blurs. People notice. They always notice. Last month, I moved into a new house. It's an old Victorian-style place, with creaky wooden floors and more mirrors than I knew what to do with. The previous owner must have had a thing for them. Every room had at least one, some so big they stretched from floor to ceiling. I didn't mind. Not at first. The first night I slept there, my blinking tic acted up. Every time I walked past a mirror, my eyes felt like they were on fire, and I couldn't stop blinking. By the time I went to bed, I was exhausted, my eyelids sore from hours of rapid flickering. I chalked it up to stress, the move, unpacking, all of it, but the next day was worse. It started in the bathroom. I was brushing my teeth when my tic kicked in, forcing me to blink harder and faster than usual. Through the blur of my rapid blinking, I thought I saw movement behind me. It wasn't me. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the pale, empty bathroom reflected back at me. I stared into the mirror, unblinking, until my eyes burned and I had to blink again. That's when I saw it. A faint shadow in the corner of the mirror. A figure, hazy and indistinct. My heart raced. I turned around, expecting to see someone behind me, but the bathroom was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the shadow was gone. Over the next few weeks, the mirrors became impossible to ignore. Every time I walked past one, I'd catch a glimpse of movement, a flash of something, or someone just out of sight. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe my imagination. But it wasn't. The reflections were changing. I started noticing faces, strange, unfamiliar faces in the mirrors. They were faint, like smudges on glass, but they were there, watching me. They didn't move, didn't blink. They just stared, their eyes unblinking and hollow. My blinking tic grew worse. Every time I looked into a mirror, my eyes would flicker uncontrollably. The faces would flicker too, like they were responding to me. It took me a while to figure it out, but eventually, I realized the flickers weren't random. They were blinking back at me. Morse code. I didn't know much about Morse code, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the blinking, my tics and theirs, was a message. I started recording myself, counting the blinks and matching them against online charts. The first message I decoded was simple. Help. The second one was worse. Let us in. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. The faces in the mirrors weren't faint smudges anymore. They were clear, sharp, and vivid. Men, women, children, all staring out at me with desperate, pleading eyes. They began to mimic me. When I scratched my arm, the faces scratched at the invisible barrier between us. When I tilted my head, they mirrored the motion perfectly. And when I blinked, they blinked back in perfect unison. It was horrifying. I covered the mirrors, every last one of them. Sheets, towels, anything I could find. For a few days, it helped. I could still feel their eyes on me, but at least I didn't have to see them. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of shattering glass. The mirrors had broken themselves. Every single one of them. I stood in the hallway, barefoot and trembling, surrounded by shards of glass. The reflections were everywhere, splintered and jagged, but the faces were still whole. They didn't need the mirrors anymore. I barricaded myself in my bedroom, piling furniture against the door. My heart pounded as I pressed my back against the wall, clutching a flashlight like a lifeline. The blinking wouldn't stop. My eyes felt raw, my vision a mess of flickering shadows and afterimages. The room grew colder. I pointed the flashlight at the far corner, and my breath hitched. One of the faces was there, pressed against the wall. It didn't move like a person. It moved like a projection, flickering and fading as it crawled closer. The blinking started again. Fast erratic, disparate. Help me. It blinked. No, I whispered, shaking my head. Help me, it repeated. The room grew darker. The flashlight flickered, its beam fading into nothing. The last thing I saw was my own reflection in the bedroom window, smiling as it reached out for me. I blinked one final tick. Help me. And then I was gone. When my neighbors broke in the next morning, the house was empty. Every mirror, every piece of glass was shattered. And the walls? They were covered in hundreds of tiny, hand-shaped smudges. Story 3. My tics have always been manageable. They were embarrassing in school. A flailing arm here, an uncontrollable leg twitch there. But they were harmless. Or at least they used to be. Things started to change around my 17th birthday. The tics became less random. Instead of the usual jerking or twitching, my arm would shoot out and point at seemingly nothing. I tried to pull it back, but it felt like my muscles weren't mine anymore. The movements were precise, deliberate. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then it got worse. In history class, my arm shot out and knocked my friend's book off his desk. As he bent to pick it up, the fluorescent light above him flickered and shattered, raining glass onto his seat. If my tic hadn't made me move his book, he would have been covered in shards. In another incident, I was walking home when my hand jabbed into the air, directing me down an alley I'd never taken before. I tried to ignore it, but my legs followed, dragging me along. Halfway down the alley, I found a wallet lying in a puddle. Inside were a driver's license and cash. It belonged to my next-door neighbor, who had been mugged the night before. The coincidences piled up. My tics weren't just random anymore. They were purposeful. My parents were worried. They booked appointment after appointment with neurologists, therapists, anyone they could think of. Every doctor ran tests and shrugged their shoulders. No one had answers until we found Dr. Gray. She was a specialist in rare neurological disorders. Her office was sleek and cold, lined with unsettling artwork that seemed to watch me as I sat in the waiting room. When she finally saw me, she asked questions that felt too specific, like she already knew what I was experiencing. When your tics direct you, do you feel a pull? Like an external force? Yes, I admitted uneasily. And when you resist, does it hurt? I nodded. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. I have a treatment we can try. It's experimental, but it might help. Desperation pushed me to agree. The medication came in the form of a dark blue liquid, administered in tiny doses. I swallowed the first vial under her watchful gaze. For a week, it seemed to work. My tics calmed, and the strange compulsion faded. But then it came back stronger. The first night the medication failed, I woke up standing in the kitchen. My body had moved on its own, my arms raised and fingers trembling as if pulling invisible strings. When I tried to sit, my legs stiffened, keeping me locked in place. My right hand jabbed toward the pantry, and before I knew it, I was pulling out a loose board from the back wall. Behind it was a hidden door. I didn't want to open it, but my body didn't care. My hands twisted the handle, and I descended a set of narrow stairs. The air was damp and reeked of mildew. A single bulb flickered to life as I reached the bottom. The room was filled with old photographs, newspaper clippings, and recordings, all about me. There were pictures of my first birthday, notes about my grades in school, even detailed observations of my tics. The more recent materials were worse. Photos of me sleeping in my bed, timestamps of when I left the house, and pages of disturbing annotations. This is where it begins, read one note beneath a photo of me in the kitchen. You can't resist forever, said another, scrawled across a diagram of the human nervous system. The final note was pinned to a large mirror at the back of the room. You'll be free when I am. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. The mirror reflected me, but something was wrong. My reflection wasn't following my movements. I stepped closer, compelled. The reflection didn't mirror me. It stood still, watching, its expression twisted into a grin that didn't belong to me. My body stiffened. No, I whispered, trying to step back, but my legs moved forward instead. The reflection raised its hand, and my arm shot up to match it. My movements weren't my own anymore. I was a puppet, and it was pulling the strings. The grin widened as the reflection mouthed, "Let me in." I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. My hands reached out, pressing against the cold surface of the mirror. The reflection's hands met mine, and then it pulled. I felt my body collapse inward, like 1,000 tiny hooks dragging me into the glass. My vision blurred as I fell forward, darkness swallowing me whole. When I opened my eyes, I was on the other side of the mirror. The room looked the same, but I couldn't move. I was trapped, my body frozen in the glass. On the other side, my reflection, the thing, stood in my place. It stretched, testing its stolen body, and turned to leave. "Wait!" I tried to shout, but no sound came. The thing paused, smirking as it looked back at me. "You'll be free when I am," it whispered. And then it was gone, leaving me alone in the cold, unyielding prison of the mirror. Story 4. I've had Tourette syndrome for most of my life. My tics have always been an annoying but familiar presence, quick bursts of words or sounds, things I couldn't control. I learned to live with them, and my husband and daughter accepted them as part of who I was. But 3 months ago, everything changed. It started with a new vocal tic, one unlike anything I'd experienced before. I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner when it happened. A low, guttural growl escaped my throat, startling even me. It didn't sound like me. It was deep, raw, and animalistic, like something crawling out of my chest. My husband, Ethan, poked his head around the corner. "Everything okay?" he asked, eyebrows raised. I nodded quickly, embarrassed. "Just a new tic," I said, brushing it off. He gave me a reassuring smile and went back to the living room. But the growl didn't go away. Over the next few days, it came more frequently. It didn't feel like my usual tics. Those were sharp, involuntary outbursts. This was different. It felt like something else was pushing the sound out of me. Ethan started noticing too. "You sure that's just a tic?" he asked one night as we were getting ready for bed. "It sounds weird." "I'm sure," I said, though I wasn't. Our 6-year-old daughter, Lily, was the next to notice. "Mommy," she said one morning, tugging on my sleeve. "I heard you growling last night. Were you mad?" I froze. "What do you mean, sweetie?" "From my room. It sounded like you, but not really you." My stomach twisted. I hadn't been in her room, and I hadn't growled that night, or at least I didn't think I had. Ethan dismissed it as Lily's imagination, but I couldn't shake the unease. Then the noises started when I wasn't home. I was out grocery shopping when Ethan called, his voice tight with concern. "Did you just get home?" he asked. "No," I said, frowning. "Why?" "Because I just heard that growl again." It came from the kitchen. My blood ran cold. When I got home, he was pale and shaken. "It was loud," he said, "and it wasn't just a tic. It was like it came from the walls." We searched the house together, looking for anything that could explain it. An animal, faulty pipes, anything. But we found nothing. The growls became more frequent after that. They echoed through the house at all hours, growing louder and more guttural. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were accompanied by something worse. Objects started moving. It began subtly. A glass would shift on the table. A chair would wobble slightly. But soon it became undeniable. One night, we watched in horror as the lamp in the living room slid across the floor and smashed against the wall. Ethan wanted to leave, but where would we go? This was our home. Then my tics changed again. The growls were replaced by words, dark, haunting phrases I would never say. "Let it in. It's watching. Don't turn around." The words came unbidden, spilling from my mouth in a voice that didn't sound like mine. I tried to explain it away as my condition, but deep down, I knew it was something else. One night, as we sat huddled in the living room, the words changed again. "It's here," I whispered. The lights flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. The growls erupted from every corner, deafening and relentless. Ethan grabbed Lily, pulling her close. "Stay together," he shouted. But the darkness was suffocating, and the noises were overwhelming. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them moving around me, shadows in the pitch-black room. Lily screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Mommy!" I reached out, but my hands found nothing. Ethan's voice came next, panicked and desperate. "Lily, where are you?" And then silence. When the lights came back, the room was empty. Ethan and Lily were gone. I searched the house frantically, calling their names, but there was no trace of them. The only sound was my own trembling breath. Then I heard it, a soft, low whisper from the walls. "It's waiting for you." The next morning, the neighbors found me sitting in the corner of the living room, rocking back and forth. "It's waiting for you," I whispered over and over. They tried to talk to me, but I couldn't stop. "It's waiting for you." They never found Ethan or Lily, and I never left the house. Story 5. Tourette's has been with me for as long as I can remember, a constant, unwelcome companion. My tics were always random and annoying but harmless. A throat clear here, a sharp jerk of the shoulder there, or an embarrassing, shouted phrase. They weren't profound or meaningful, just noise. But 3 months ago, my tics changed. I was walking to work when my throat let out a guttural, rasping laugh. It startled me. I'd never laughed like that before, not with that kind of malice. It didn't feel like me. Seconds later, I heard the screech of tires. A car spun out on the slick road ahead, skidding into a street lamp. That laugh came again, low and guttural. I told myself it was coincidence. It wasn't. The prediction started slow. My tics muttered, "Watch your step," just before a child tripped over a crack in the sidewalk. Then, move left, right before a tree branch fell where I'd been walking. Helpful, almost kind, but it didn't last. One night, my tic screamed, "Break it," as I passed a young couple arguing on a park bench. Before I could process it, the man slammed his fist into the bench, breaking it in two. He stormed off, leaving the woman sobbing in the dark. I tried to ignore it, to pretend my tics weren't changing, but the phrases grew darker. "Make it bleed," my tic whispered as I passed a stray dog. My body stiffened, my hands twitching toward a loose brick on the ground. I resisted, forcing myself to keep walking, but the strain was unbearable. My muscles ached like I'd run a marathon, and my head pounded. That night, I dreamed of blood. My family noticed the changes. My wife, Laura, tried to brush it off at first. "You're stressed," she said, her tone more hopeful than convincing. "Work's been rough. Maybe you just need a break." She didn't say that again after the incident at the dinner table. We were eating spaghetti when my tic said, "Drop the glass." It was loud, forceful. My hand trembled as I fought the urge, gripping my glass of water, so tightly I thought it might shatter. "Drop it!" the tic screamed again louder. I couldn't stop. My hand jerked, the glass slipping from my grip and shattering on the floor. "Jesus, Nikki!" Laura shouted, leaping back as shards scattered across the tile. I stammered an apology, but my tic cut me off, muttering, "This is just the start." Laura's face paled. We didn't finish dinner. The next day, I wrote a letter to Laura and our son, Max. I begged them to leave, to take a trip, stay with her parents, anything to get away from me. I didn't explain why. I couldn't. Instead, I wrote, "If I do something horrible, please know it wasn't me." I left the note on the kitchen counter and went to bed, hoping they'd be gone by morning. They weren't. Laura sat across from me at breakfast, her face drawn and pale. Max fidgeted with his cereal, glancing between us with wide, worried eyes. "I'm not leaving," Laura said firmly. "Whatever this is, we'll get through it together." I wanted to argue, to beg her to reconsider, but my tic spoke first. "They'll regret that." The commands escalated. My tics no longer predicted events, they caused them. "Turn here," my tic said while I was driving home from work. My hands yanked the wheel sharply, veering into the oncoming lane. I swerved back just in time to avoid a collision, my heart hammering in my chest. At home, I tried to lock myself in the garage. If I couldn't control my body, maybe I could contain it. But the tics wouldn't let me. "Out," they whispered. "Out now." I felt my legs moving, dragging me toward the door. My hands clawed at the lock, twisting it open despite my protests. My body wasn't mine anymore. The worst night started with a whisper. "Build it." I sat at my workbench, trembling as my hands moved on their own, gathering tools and materials. "Stop," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Please stop." But my hands didn't listen. They worked tirelessly, assembling something I didn't understand. A device, intricate and menacing, with wires and circuits I didn't recognize. "It's finished," my tick whispered hours later. I stared at the device, horrified. "What is it?" I asked aloud, my voice shaking. My tick didn't answer, but my body smiled. Laura found me in the garage the next morning, slumped over the workbench. "Nick," she said cautiously, stepping closer. I tried to warn her, to tell her to run, but my tick screamed before I could. "It's finished!" The device activated with a high-pitched whine, followed by a deafening pulse. Laura collapsed instantly, her body crumpling to the floor. I screamed, fighting against the invisible force controlling me, but it was useless. Max ran into the garage, his eyes wide with fear. "Mom? Dad? What's happening?" I tried to stop him, to shield him, but my body didn't move. The pulse hit him next. In the silence that followed, I stood alone in the garage. My family lay motionless at my feet, and the device crackled with a faint, sinister energy. My body turned toward the mirror on the wall. I saw myself smiling, but it wasn't my smile. It wasn't me. Thanks for watching. If you like the story, click like, subscribe to the channel, and write an idea for the next story in the comments.